And we should be recording. Okay, excellent. And if you have any questions, we're likely to mute everybody here at the beginning, but what we ask you to do is hold on to your questions, jot them down, and then we'll definitely have time at the end of the webinar to review any questions that any of you might have. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. First of all, we want, before we jump into the GOTV topic, we wanted to talk about the amazing work that's already been going on the ground across the US with the different indivisible groups that many of you are a part of. So where have we been? What have we been doing these last few weeks, months even, leading up to the November 6 elections? It turns out we've been doing a lot of work. We have 2,316 volunteers doing voter contact out in the field. We've got we've had 5,396 conversations held at the door. We've had 8,714 conversations over the phone. And then finally, we have had 1,540,263 total contacts through all of our voter contact efforts and methods. This includes those phone conversations, that includes those canvassing conversations and all of our texting efforts. This is a huge amount of work, and all of this is what makes our GOTV efforts possible, because all of this work is what's going to make it, what's going to allow us to focus in on our supporters and making sure that they make it to the polls on November 6th. So what are our goals for today's session? Well, we're going to spend the next hour or so talking about really three things. This is an opportunity to share with you some GOTV basics. What is the universe of people we're talking to? How are we talking to them? And what's the messaging we're going to use? What's the script? We're also going to share with you the strategy behind the Indivisible GOTV plan. And then finally, we're going to discuss what this means for all of you in the field and how you can plug in. To do all of that, we have a 5-part agenda. We're going to first start off with those basics. So what is GOTV? When is it? And then we're going to go into those 3 focus points. The universe, exactly who we're talking to, the tactics we're using, the messaging we're using, and then finally how all of you can help. Okay, so let's jump in. Let's talk about GOTV basics. What does GOTV stand for? I think many of you know this already, but GOTV stands for Getting Out the Vote. And this is the moment in the campaign where we go from talking to a wide range of people and trying to identify who our supporters are, who supports our values in our candidates, to a much narrower group of people. And it's about making sure that our supporters actually show up to vote on election day. And the reason we do this is because there's been a lot of testing that proves that small nudges during a key period of time right before an election make a big difference in whether a person turns out to vote. And so really, the only thing that changes in our GOTV conversations are our script. We change what we say a little bit, which we'll get into here in a moment, and then that group that we're talking to or focused in on our supporters. But why is GOTV important? The best way to answer this question is to look at the map that I have for you in front of the screen here. So if you'll take a look, what you'll notice is this map outlines the percentage of voters who turned out for the 2016 presidential election. Now keep in mind that a presidential election is something that a lot more voters turn out for already. Midterm elections, a lot of times our numbers go down significantly. And so even in a presidential election, what this map shows us is that voter turnout can be quite low. We're talking percentages between the 50 range to the 75 range. And this is because voting is a habit. GOTV is incredibly important because it pushes that habit forward. It really makes it possible for people to turn out to vote, even though voting is low. And it's really about building that long-term power along with winning during that specific election. Okay, so when is GOTV? Traditionally, for any of you who have worked a campaign maybe with a candidate or with a party, traditionally GOTV is the last 4 days before Election Day. But for Indivisible, it's a little different. We've expanded it to be the last 2 weeks before Election Day. There's also one exception. Some of you may have noticed that we've switched to GOTV a little bit earlier, and that's because of early voting. If you had early voting in your state, it's possible that we switched to GOTV mode right at that point. But for the most part, it's 2 weeks before Election Day. Okay, so one more time. What changes during GOTV? The universe changes, the messaging changes, and then finally the third thing to think about is that everything is bigger during GOTV. We have a lot more volunteers. That means we need to think about all the resources that are necessary to support those volunteers in terms of having enough packets and having enough turf, having enough calls, phone calls to make. The whole operation grows in size because it's all about getting all of that voter contact to happen in the last few days before the election. Okay. We've talked about the basics of GOTV. Let's really talk about this universe now. Who are we going to be talking to? So what you've got in front of you is some blank squares, and I'm going to point out the axis. We're going to be filling in each one of these squares with different types of voters. This is the whole span of our voting populace. And from low to high on the left, you've got low likelihood to vote. So this row of people is going to be folks who don't turn out to vote very often. Middle row over here is going to be people who maybe turn out to vote for a presidential election, but not a lot else. And then the top are folks who turn out to vote all the time. So low likelihood to high likelihood. And then the axis on the top is likelihood for someone to support our candidate. So on the left, they don't support our candidates. In the middle, maybe they're undecided. And on the right is our actual supporters. So what does that look like? We've got on the top line the folks who always turn out. On the left, so that's the base of our opposition. In the middle, those are prime persuasion targets. And on the right, we've got our base. And then in the middle, these are the folks who turn out to vote sometimes, but need that extra nudge so that we can make sure that they really show up on election day. On the left, that's opposition prime GOTV targets. The middle, these are our secondary persuasion targets. And then on the right, that's our prime GOTV target. And then finally, we've got the opposition secondary GOTV target. These are folks who definitely need a nudge to show up and vote. Our low persuasion targets and our secondary GOTV targets. Okay, so what does this all mean? Who are we actually talking to on a regular basis? Our current universe, the universe of people we've been talking to before switching to GOTV, is outlined in blue. We've got anybody who turns out on a regular basis who we think we can persuade is in our base. We want to talk to them. We want to touch base with them. Anyone we think needs that extra nudge but is persuadable and, again, needs our extra nudge and is our supporter, we talk to them. And we also talk to our secondary GOTV targets, the folks who we know support us but don't turn out very often, in hopes of getting them on a higher ring and getting them out to vote. This is our wide universe that we've been talking to so far. For GOTV, it switches. It narrows and we focus in more specifically. We don't worry quite so much about the folks who we know are going to turn out to vote because they don't need that nudge as much as that secondary row. We really need to make sure that the people who don't turn out regularly turn out this time. And if they're in the persuasion group, we're talking to them. And if they're in our base, we're talking to them. And then finally, we're also including that secondary GOTV target. The last thing that's important to note about this slide is that we've included new registrants. And this is something that's actually specific to the Indivisible GOTV universe. And this is so that we're linking those new registrants into our conversations. We're building that long-term power. And this is one of the advantages of doing canvassing and phone banking with Indivisible, including these individuals in our GOTV universe. Okay, let's move on to tactics now. So I think we all know that there are a lot of different ways to talk to voters out there. There's canvassing, there's phone banking, there's texting, there's email, there's mail, and different people are reachable by different modes. And all of these tactics have pros and cons. The great thing about Indivisible is we are trying all of them. From the national scale, we are engaging in every single one of these tactics so that we can cover reaching voters in a lot of different ways. But the thing that's unique about direct voter contact is that it is the most effective way to increase turnout. And the beauty of direct voter contact is that it is the most effective when local messengers are the ones who are delivering and having those conversations. So direct voter contact, as it turns out, is the superpower of all of you. Everybody who's out in the field, everybody who's part of an Indivisible group or is in their community wanting to make a difference, direct voter contact is the most effective way for you to talk to voters and make sure that you're boosting our numbers come November 6th. What do we mean by direct voter contact? We really mean canvassing and phone banking. Canvassing is the #1 most effective way to reach voters, but phone banking is a very close second. And of course, all of you know your communities the best. So it's about thinking through which method makes most sense for you. If you live in an urban area, for example, you may find that canvassing really is the most effective way, and you want to maximize the fact that canvassing is going to boost your numbers the most. But maybe if you're in a rural area, you think to yourself, for me to canvass, the houses are going to be really far apart. Let's focus on phone banking, because even though it's second most effective, it makes more sense for our community. Either way, though, what we suggest is for your time during GOTV, when you're thinking about how do I spend my time, focus in on canvassing a targeted list, that #1 over there, with mixed methods nationally. For that to be effective, it depends on voter contact, direct voter contact locally. So start off with canvassing. Move to phone banking secondly. We want to make sure to talk to everyone once before looping back. So focus in on phone banking as a second option. And then third, if you've got a lot of volunteers, if you've been doing a lot of canvassing and phone banking, you can also expand to texting. Because if you want to reach a third way, that is that's the third most effective and the thing that we would focus in on. We would suggest you focus in on third. Okay. So you know who we're talking to, you know how we're talking to them. Let's talk about what we're actually going to say. What is our GOTV messaging? Well, GOTV is about precision. The words that we've built into the script are tested and they're proven to increase the likelihood for a person to vote, but the script is only a guide. As it turns out, testing has shown that the most effective method or the most effective thing that we need to have in these conversations, element that we need to have in these conversations, is being real. Having a natural and real conversation with a voter is more important than getting the words right. And so what we urge you to do is to think about the script. We're going to review it in detail now, practice it. Don't veer too far off of it, but make sure that you have a real conversation when you're talking to voters. Okay. So the proven fact that we're working off of here is that talking to people in your community right before an election increases their likelihood to vote. This is the baseline we're working off of. But there are 3 specific things that if you include in this conversation, it makes it even more effective. It makes it even more likely that that person will turn out to vote. Okay, so we've got a standard message here on the left. You'll see in the thought bubble, we've got, "Hi, John, it's Olga from over on 3rd Street. Are you planning to vote next week?" This is a pretty standard message. It would make a difference if you decided to go out and talk to people in this way. Even if you said this one sentence, it can make a difference. But if you include 3 things, providing a specific amount of detail, mentioning civic duty, and using something called social pressure, if you put these 3 things into your script, it maximizes the likelihood that that person turns out to vote. Let's talk about that providing detail first. What we mean by providing detail is talking about 4 things. When election day actually is, the location where the person can vote, what they should bring, for example, do they need to bring an ID or not, and then finally reminding them that it's simple. So what would that look like? It would be something like, "Hi, John, it's Olga from over on 3rd Street. Are you planning to vote on election day? Voting is easy. Our election place is a library. Polls are open from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Here's what you need to bring. Thanks." So you can see adding those levels of detail, that's what can make a really big difference. Now, that was providing the details. Let's talk about civic duty next. What we mean by this is we want to talk about voting as an act rather than the specific issues or candidates that we support. So it's about connecting it to our democracy and also connecting the act of voting as a civic duty and our responsibility as active members of our community. What that looks like is, hi, John, it's Olga from over on 3rd Street. Are you planning to vote in the election? As a member of this community, we have a civic duty to go out and vote. Democracy depends on all of us being accountable and making our voices heard through voting. Voting is easy. Our polling place is a library. Polls are open from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Here's what you need to bring, and thanks. You'll see the person has gotten much more excited. There is glitter involved this time. Finally, let's talk about the social influence. What we mean by social influence is really, it's twofold. As I think many of you are likely to know, whether you voted or not is public record. And if we use the history, that person's individual history of voting as a nudge for them to vote in the future, it turns out to be a very effective method. So that's number one of social pressure. Number two of social pressure is talking about this as if it's something everyone is doing. People don't, it isn't effective to talk about how we need you to turn out because turnout is really low and we need you to show up and support our candidate. That's not an effective message. Instead, we want to talk about how everybody's doing it and you don't want to miss this very exciting party that is called Election Day. So what does this look like? We've got another script here in front of you. This combines all three of these elements into one. So, hi, John. It's Olga from over on 3rd Street. Are you planning to vote in this election? As a member of this community, we have a civic duty to go out and vote. Democracy depends on all of us being accountable and making our voices heard through voting. Public records show you have a history of voting. Are you planning to vote on Election Day? Oh, great. Voting is easy. Our polling place is a library. Polls are open from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Here's what you need to bring. I've talked to a lot of people in the neighborhood who are voting, so I'm really glad to hear that you are as well. So you can see there is a way to combine all of these into one, and this would be the most effective way to have a conversation and make sure or increase the likelihood that that person will turn out to vote. Whew, okay, that was a lot. So let's take a moment to review some things. So first of all, keep in mind that you don't have to memorize the script. We will be providing this script through the Voter Action Network, through the main tool, the tool that we use to do canvassing and phone banking. So if you're connected with an Indivisible group, if you're doing work out in the ground, you're more than likely connected to our tool, and inside of the Voter Action Network, we will have these scripts. We will also be distributing copies of these scripts, so if you're not in contact with your organizer, you should definitely connect with them, and we'd be happy to help make that connection because there are copies of this available. But then finally, we're going to be doing a lot more training. So if you want a little bit more practice and you want to think through what this really means for your work on the ground, we have 4 really fantastic opportunities for further training before Election Day. The first is this Wednesday. We're doing a volunteer recruitment training on the 17th. Our next training is next Monday, which is direct voter contact through a racial equity lens on the 22nd. Excuse me, that should say Monday the 22nd. And then finally, we've got 2 repeat sessions of GOTV, DVC, and U on the 24th and the 31st. Many opportunities to get training, and you can always talk to your organizer for extra resources or extra assistance. Okay, so let's review it one more time. What did we just talk about? 4 major elements. The script is a guide. It's important to have a natural a natural conversation rather than being a robot and sticking to a script. But inside of that, there are 3 things that if we include, maximize our voter contact efforts. That is providing details on voting, emphasizing democratic participation over issues or candidates, and using light, hopefully non-creepy social pressure, talking about the history of that person voting in the past. Okay, so what can you commit to do right now? How can you help? I'm guessing that all of you are on this webinar in part to know how you can plug into this really important work leading up to November 6th. Well, there are two major ways. The first is working with a local Indivisible group. If you don't know who your local Indivisible group is, maybe you've found us from the website or you've been connected in a different way, a really great place to start is the Act Locally site that we have up here on the screen. Feel free to copy it. We will be sharing these slides afterwards and all these resources, so you can also look out for an email. But we have a map that lays out Indivisible groups across the country, and that's a great place to start when you're looking for Indivisible groups in your state or in your city. You can always talk to an organizer as well and find the Indivisible group that way. So first of all, find your Indivisible group. Second of all, start canvassing or phone banking. We have a lot of events on the website. You can also go to indivisible.org/events to find canvassing and phone banking opportunities near you, and then again, talking with an Indivisible organizer. If you don't choose to go the local Indivisible group route, another option is working with Indivisible National. We have two major opportunities to do that. Phone banking, the link is already, is also up there on the screen for you, or texting. You can be part of the texting team across the country. Okay, that is our overall briefing. Let's see, I am going to take a look at, I'm going to go ahead and take a look at the chat. We've got a couple other staff who are also on here. We're happy to take questions now. If folks want to either type them into the chat box, or if you want to raise your hand, we can absolutely unmute you and hear from you. But we'd love to answer any questions that folks have and dig into this further, depending on what questions you all have. Okay, we've got a question for Jean. I quit putting events and we have lots of them on your calendar because it is so difficult to get the RSVPs. Can someone help with that? I would definitely suggest not to stop putting events on our map. We know that it is a little bit cumbersome to go through that process, but we urge you to do it because this is the best way that we can connect on a national scale and that we can really make sure that other people have an opportunity to find out from your events who aren't in your direct network. So even though it is a little bit frustrating, we ask that you keep putting things up on the website, and always talking to your organizer is the best point of contact for any questions like that. And we also promise that we're working to make the website easier, but things take time. So in the meantime, please don't stop putting things up on the events, even though it is a little bit cumbersome to use. Okay. Oh, a lot of questions are jumping in. Okay, we've got a question from Scott. Any suggestions about avoiding arguing with conservatives? Let's see, what an interesting question. So the good news is that our universe is now switching from away from the folks who are persuadable. So maybe you are more likely to talk to somebody who would need some convincing, so to speak, in the past. But now, since we're really pretty focused in on our supporters, the conversations are changing a little bit. It's no longer about persuasion, and it's really about identifying, are you really a supporter? And if so, we want to get you the information that you need to turn out to vote. So that, because of that, we're really switching from persuasion to GOTV, and you're less likely to have those conversations. But this is a really great question about how we have these conversations in terms of persuasion. We won't be covering that during this webinar, but hold on to that thought, Scott, and come back to some of our other trainings, because this is a fundamental part of organizing, is how do we change people's minds. But for this focus right now, we're not so much worried about changing people's minds. We want to get our supporters out. Okay. So we've got a couple more questions. We've got a question from Lynn. I don't have a smartphone, and it seems that you need one to canvass. If not, how do I do it? Well, the good news is that you aren't required to use a smartphone in order to canvass. We do have the Minivan app, which is, I'm guessing, what you're referring to, and that is that's the most common way to canvass. So if you do have a smartphone and you're comfortable with it, we definitely urge you to use it. But there are some backup methods. In some cases where there really isn't an option when it comes to using the minivan. You can use a hard list, or you can borrow a cell phone, or we can match you up to go out on the doors with somebody else who's handling the technology. There's a lot of ways to take care of that, so I would definitely urge you to go and sign up for some canvassing opportunities, even though you're not comfortable using an iPhone or a smartphone, because we do have other alternatives when it comes to that. Okay, I am going to switch it over. I think we've got a couple other staff on, so I do want to take a moment to introduce Lexi Coburn, who's on our training team, who is helping look through these questions. And Lexi, do you have a specific question that you were going to bring to the front now?
Yeah, hi Yoga, and hi everyone. Yes, I'm Lexi, and there is a question I do want to answer. That is Scott Schroeder's question. He said that any thoughts about leaving a printout of the script? So there's two answers to this question, Scott. One of them is that if you know that your area that you're going to be canvassing in is an endorsed candidate from Indivisible National, then you would leave literature behind if you have that. If you don't have literature, and if the candidate that you're going to be canvassing for is not an endorsed candidate, then we would suggest not leaving the script behind. The way that the GOTV universe works is that we will keep putting that door as a pass-through until we contact someone on that door. A lot of GOTV universes are like this, including ours, where we knock on the door until they vote. So you can literally say that at the door, because a lot of people say, oh, you guys knocked on my door before. I'm like, well, we won't stop until you vote. So your move there, buddy. That is it's a great notion, but we will pass through those doors anyway until they actually have a conversation and until they actually vote. So leaving a print out the script isn't necessarily needed. Does that make sense, Scott? You can just go ahead and answer. You can unmute yourself and answer, or you're good. You're good to go. I'll go ahead and I'll also answer Carolyn Weinbaum's question. Hi, Carolyn. Does Indivisible have door hangers for Indivisible candidates, specifically Stacey Abrams? Stacey Abrams is an endorsed candidate. We don't have door hangers, but we do have literature, pieces of literature to be given out there. You should definitely get in touch with your organizer, Whitney Roberts, for that information for the literature. Okay, Olga, I'll pass it right back to you.
Okay, excellent. We've got a couple questions about coordination in terms of different efforts calling the same person more than once. So one of the questions is, I have made calls before and some people say they get too many calls. How do we make sure we aren't calling people other orgs have called? I actually want to tap Andrew. Andrew, do you want to handle this question? And sure. Yeah, perfect, thanks.
Cool. So there's a couple of answers to the question about like coordination and making sure people don't get called too many times. In some ways, we're really limited in what we can do, so we can't with candidates because we are on what's called the independent expenditure side, which is just, there's a lot of complicated, sorry, hold on. Apparently it's hard to hear me. All right.
Deb, is this better? Sure, great. So yeah, there's a couple of things here with the people getting too many calls and coordinating calls. One, we can't legally coordinate with candidates or like discuss with them who they're talking to, just because we're on what's called the independent expenditure side of campaigns. And so we're prohibited from talking to campaigns about who they're talking to. So there's a little bit of just there's nothing we can do in that situation. A lot of this depends on also which districts you're in. Some districts like the Colorado 6 or Texas 23rd, a whole lot like this. A lot of these really competitive districts. This is always an issue every year. I will say, talk to your organizer and see if there's talk with them about seeing if there's something we can do. And the last thing I will say is during GOTV, we are expanding our universe out from what most folks, most campaigns and most organizations will be talking to. We're much more inclusive in our universe. And so you probably might talk to some folks who are been talked to by others, but you also definitely talk to folks who no one else thinks is worthy to be talked to, and we disagree, which is why they're in our universe. So we've done our best with our universe to, and in coordination with other groups, to prevent this, but there's only so much we can do.
Thank you, Andrew. Okay, we've got another question, so don't go far. I think this one's for you as well. Yeah. I came across the app Vote With Me, which can be used on a small scale to do GOTV with your personal contacts. Are you guys familiar with this? Any thoughts about it? It seems it could be very impactful if it got more use, but doesn't look like it has many downloads as of yet.
Yeah, so these are what's called relational organizing tools, and they basically get your own personal networks out to vote. So eventually these tools will be wonderful. And they, in a lot of cases, are wonderful. Like you said, a problem is scale. Getting a whole lot of folks to use them is an issue. Also, the ones that I've encountered all have a lot of bugs. And so there's a little bit of difficulty using them. Just because of the speed of the detection, we're not using them, but they are very powerful tools in a lot of situations, because I mean, it just makes sense. Like, you are the best messenger for the people you know to get them out to vote. So we definitely don't say don't use them, but use them in coordination with everything else you're doing, especially canvassing and phone banking.
And that also is a nice reminder that it's not just about getting folks out to vote who you know personally, so that might include your friends or your family, but for those of you who are part of Indivisible groups, or maybe you're part of other community organizations, making sure everybody in your group is actually fully registered to vote and is showing up on election day is incredibly important. It's about our supporters. It's not just about our GOTV universe in the van. Our supporters are, you know, anybody in our network who we know needs to show up on election day. It's up to us to make sure that we get them there. One more, let's see, I'm going to scroll down to the bottom and see. Okay, we've got a couple more questions that have come in. Okay, can you briefly describe the science used to derive our universe of contacts? Was it guided by academic studies, for example? Andrew, this is definitely for you.
Yeah. Yes, so there is an organization, a collaborative of academics and campaign people called the Analyst Institute. And they coordinate and facilitate a lot of research around GOTV. So researchers from, University of California, Santa Barbara, from Harvard, a lot of like really top flight institutions work with the Analyst Institute. The problem with the Analyst Institute is that a lot of its research is not public. So those of us who are part of the analyst group, who are like political data folks, get access to it, but one of the rules being part of the analyst group is not sharing the data. So it's kind of like Fight Club, don't talk about Fight Club. So our universes are definitely informed and constructed using these best practices and this research from academia and from the field, but we can't necessarily share that out because otherwise I wouldn't be able to see the research anymore. I don't want to do that.
All right. One other question. We completed van training from Indivisible and would love to use it to its fullest potential, but we can't cut turf. We have an experienced Canvas organizer who could help us prioritize the doors we need to knock on. As it is, we have a list of 65,000, which is kind of impossible. Any chance we could get a little more access?
So that is a question for your organizer. And yeah, run that through your organizer. I will say that's getting to the point where, you know, with GOTV, I think one of the things that Lexi mentioned, Olga mentioned about the script is that like genuine conversations are what's important. And this is kind of a thing here as well. More access and more ability to control things like scripts and lists at this point in the election, it's not as effective as you think. So I wouldn't worry as much about that. But if it's really something you feel strongly about, definitely lift out to your organizer, and we'll talk to you more there.
Mm-hmm. So that's a follow-up on a one-on-one.
Yep.
Excellent. Keep bringing in your questions, folks. We are happy to take on some more. I do want to bring up one point which I think speaks to an earlier question around leaving a script, because one question that we get often is, when should we be canvassing or phone banking? What are the best hours to do that? And I think this question sort of speaks to that. If you're not reaching people on the doors or on phone banking, maybe, you know, thinking about when is it that you're when are you having those conversations? When are you doing those direct voter contact efforts? Do you want to speak to that a little bit, Andrea, about when the best hours are?
Yeah, it really just depends on your audience. So if folks are, you know, of the age where they're working and they've got kids, it's like, don't knock on their door, make phone calls to them, you know, between 9 and 5:30, because they're at work, they're picking up their kids from school, and folks get angry with you if you knock on their door, make phone calls while they're at work. They get less angry when you're doing it during dinner. I know that sounds weird, but it's true. But if you're talking to some folks who may be retired or work from home, like, you know, those folks, any point in time is good. We generally do not suggest talking to folks before 9 a.m. or after 9 p.m. Definitely at the doors dark is the limit. But unless you're, you know, in Alaska where it's dark all the time on election day. But yeah, just when those people will be home and when they would be receptive, depending on the audience.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Okay. Any other questions? Feel free to raise your hand. Feel free to unmute yourself or jump in on the chat box. It usually takes about 30 to 60 seconds to think of a question. So we're reaching that time though. I think we might be there. All right, thank you so much, folks. We will be sending out the slide deck that we shared with all of you today. We will be sending out a recording of this video and including all of the links that we shared with you and all the opportunities to get involved. We'll also have an evaluation, so please look out for these emails and take a moment to fill out the evaluation. We very much want to know whether this information was helpful. We're building a bigger amount of trainings for the rest of this year, even beyond Election Day and into January 2019. So feedback from all of you is a huge deal for us. And thank you so much for joining us today, and have a good night. May we win on November 6th. Yay!
Bye.
Good luck, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Lynn, do we still have you on? Great. Okay, so I'm just going to repeat it back. Let's see. I don't know if Andrew is still on here, but I may be able to answer that as well. So it looks like your question, Lynn, there was one last one that came in. Where do we get lists? So this is for phone banking and canvassing, I'm assuming. You definitely want to use our VAN, the tool, so the Voter Action Network. You can use OpenVPV, which is the phone banking element of it, or Minivan, which is the canvassing element of it, and that is where our universe is stored. So if you need any help getting into VAN, definitely talk to your organizer, and that's the best entry point, but that is the tool that we're using to do all of this voter contact.
Lynn, do you know who your organizer is? Okay, what state are you in? California. What part of California? There's like 3 organizers there. LA, perfect. I'm going to connect you with the organizer out there and we'll get you squared away. Okay, Lynn? No problem.
Thank you so much. All right, folks, if there aren't any more questions, we can still take a couple, but if there aren't any more questions, I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting.
Lynn, go ahead and drop your email here before Olga ends the meeting.
Good call. Vicky, you know what we'll include to your question, Vicky, that you don't know how to find an organizer? We'll go ahead and include the organizer contact information per state. So that'll be a really great opportunity to connect with an organizer that way. Or you can always feel free to email me or Lexi and we can connect you to an organizer. Our contact information is inside of the training. One of our 2 emails would have been in the registration that you got for this webinar. So either way, we can connect you one way or another. Oh, okay, we've got one
Can I answer that?
Yeah.
Great. Hey, Michael. So civic duty, civic duty is persuasive. The reason why it works is because we're in a time in our country where accountability and responsibility is something that we really do want to key in on because democracy isn't free. A lot of us hadn't been able to vote, and I'm not even talking about civil rights movement or any kind of movement before. There's voter suppression run rampant. There's voter ID happening in states. This is our responsibility to defend our democracy. And the thing is that a lot of people that we're talking to may or may not understand just what is at stake. It is really our responsibility to articulate that when we knock on doors. So we're using civic duty as kind of like a foot in the door to start talking about a more broader subject around why voting matters, why casting your ballot matters, why speaking up matters. A lot of times when we go in, a lot of times I've seen in different campaigns, when you go right into the partisan politics, you'll turn people off. And that's the reason why we're not, because number one, we're a nonpartisan organization, whether people believe that or not. We actually are nonpartisan. So why we use civic duty is because we want to put that foot in the door so that we can actually start talking about, don't worry about Republicans, don't worry about Democrats, don't worry about what's happening in the news. This is what is happening in your community. It's your civic duty to make sure if you don't like what's happening, you have a chance to change it. So it's talking about that and getting them into that awareness of thinking that puts our foot into the door and turns out voters, because that's what they want to hear. And that's what they need to be hearing. Does that make sense, Michael?
And one more thing that I would add, because I was also of this, I was surprised when I first heard this, and I think one of the things that's really great about the fact that there's a lot of research out there is this testing is done where literally, you look at the numbers when people just talk about issues and candidates, and you look at the numbers when people talk about civic duty, and it turns out that the research shows that civic duty is more effective than just talking about those issues and candidates. And I think it's for the reason that Lexi explained, but yeah, I think it was surprising for a few of us out there, and that's why this type of research is so important. and why we're basing so much of our script and our universe decisions on that rather than just personal experiences. It's really based on these science-backed results. Okay. All right, I think we're gonna call it there. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And again, if you look for an email from us, and if you would like more training, we've got some great opportunities until Election Day, and we hope to see you there.
Have a wonderful night, everyone.